any other church. I find a blanket concern in Jesus that if you want to really be my disciple, you have to give the money away. Now, I would say that probably, in most cases, it was inherited. It was what we called old money. It was the kind of people that lived at Palm Beach or whatever. But in some cases where, at least in parabolic form, where it's somebody who has earned something himself very successfully, the condemnation is still there. And that's a drastic difference. By the way, this is pretty much an American, it used to be a European problem. Okay? It's not a problem for European Christianity, because who in Europe really takes Christianity seriously anymore? I mean, quite honestly. Church attendance in Europe, England 3%, Sweden 1%, France, which is 95% Catholic, 6% attend church. Church attendance in Italy is 8 or 9%, Spain is 10%. And those are the more religious ones. I mean, the Europeans have long given up on taking Christianity seriously. In the Caucasian world, Christianity is taken seriously in North, South, and Central America. And in Central America and in South America, particularly in Latin America, where the liberation theology movement emerged in the 60s, and in Europe they gave up on this long ago. I find, as I read the international, and I have taught in Korea and traveled and taught at a theological seminary in Korea, the vast majority of the concerted effort to defend the wealthy Christian comes from American evangelicals. It's very rarely found elsewhere. The distribution is so disproportionately American evangelical. Liberal Protestants gave up on it long ago. They just say, look, we don't really believe the guy anymore. We know he can't really send us to hell and keep us there forever, so we're going to continue to be country club Christians. But the idea of making the concerted effort to defend opulence among Christians is an almost totally American evangelical approach to Christianity. I don't know whether that's background or where you may have read it. There are some interesting things that American evangelicals have done, but they've violated the gospel in a lot of ways. It's only the American evangelical gospel where Christianity is such an individual thing. You make your decision, bow your head, repeat this prayer, get it over with. It's not a New Testament teaching at all. As I mentioned, saint never appears in the singular New Testament. It's always in a collective sense. It's an adjective that never appears singular, always in the plural. You can't be, according to the New Testament, you can't be a Christian excluded from a community of other people. Unlike, as my students have heard me say, unlike Tom T. Hall in the 70s, who had that great country hit, Me and Jesus got our own thing going. We don't need a church, we don't need a preacher, we don't need any fancy singing, it's just me and Jesus. Lots of people like that, but it's a very foreign idea to the New Testament. Free, of course, to hold it, by all means. My concern would not be with Tom T. Hall or evangelicals or anyone else. My concern as a scholar, as a professor, would be people sort of superimposing these interpretations upon Jesus to defend it. I think the honest scholar would let Jesus speak for himself and say that there are some sticky points, like his occasional retributivism. Jesus himself is something of a retributivist, even though he's the one who's constantly talking about forgiving and turning the other cheek. There's clearly a tension there. Other questions? Very fascinating group. John?
You say that you have to give away all your wealth. He says, why did he not make his women give away their wealth?
Well, they were.
I mean, they were, but not in the sense to say
Yeah.
the poor beggar on the street.
That's a good question. So what do we do, say, in Luke 8 with these three women who are paying Jesus' way? I think the answer would be they're giving their wealth for the sake of the kingdom. And through Jesus, he's helping the poor, and he's feeding the people, and he's taking care of indigent people, disadvantaged people. By the way, one I haven't mentioned in here that really could be taken up is there's an enormous concern of Jesus for physically handicapped people. He says on one occasion, when you make a banquet, don't invite wealthy people. They don't need the banquet. He says, go and find, and then King James says, the lame, the maimed, the deaf, and they'll come to your banquet and give them a place. So they're one more, you could probably fit it under socioeconomic reversal. But yeah, I think the solution would probably lie in Well, these women, in giving their support to Jesus, are in fact investing in the kingdom. Only Luke tells that story about these women. Their names are given, and one is mentioned as married. I think that's perhaps the more scintillating aspect. David, question? No? Yes?
It seems like from your description of Jesus' take on the socioeconomic thing, that he'd be more of a socialist or a communist than a liberal.
Yeah, that's probably true. He might transcend. So maybe you could have a bumper sticker that says Jesus is a Jewish commie, a Jewish socialist. Certainly a liberal, in some sense of the word, but maybe that's not as good a category as that. But my people, of course, would fight you to death. They don't, first of all, believe Jesus is really Jewish, and they certainly don't believe he's liberal. In one of the greatest retorts I ever heard, when I was a young person, and I challenged a relative, and I said, wasn't Jesus Jewish? One of my uncles said, yes, but only on his mother's side. It was one of the wittier retorts. You don't hear wit that often in Mississippi, so when you do, you remember it for a lifetime. Only on his mother's side, alluding to the virgin birth idea, I guess. Actually, I heard it preached in churches pretty much that Jesus was a Gentile and God was this sort of cranky old Jewish man from the days of Moses, rather than the other way around. Dr. Merritt.
Since Matthew bring that up, what about sexual ethics in Jesus' eyes?
Yeah.
What does he say about that?
I think for Jesus they're a secondary issue. But I appreciated your presentation, and by the way, if you haven't yet enrolled for philosophy of religion, you should be pursuing a great opportunity that's coming your way in a few weeks. One of my favorite areas. There's no question that for Jesus, the idea of the serial marriage is a far bigger issue than probably almost all other sexual ethical issues. Jesus would easily frown upon seventh and eighth marriage, and the Britney Spears, she married for 6 hours in Las Vegas or whatever. I mean, this sort of casual attitude. But there's very little in the Gospels about sexual ethics. Christian sexual ethics generally in the New Testament are taken from Paul, who is very picky about a lot of things. I mean, Paul is I can see why Augustine so admired him. But if you take Paul to be consistent about that, then you can enforce all of Paul's sexual ethics and say, well, the Bible says. But you also have to have women who come to church, who keep their mouths shut, who keep their heads covered, and who go home and obediently ask their husbands questions. They can't talk in church, according to Paul. And you rarely find somebody that now so lives. So there's an inconsistency there. Jesus' I think, his concern with sexual ethics tended to be with what were the most common violations of his day. And that tended to be problems that stemmed from men either casually divorcing their wives, which the law permitted them to do for virtually no reason at all, where the woman could not reciprocate in a divorce situation. Or it tended to be, perhaps this was the worldview of his day, that the real problem in sex is that the men are lustful and dominating and taking advantage of. Those are the kind of sexual ones that Jesus gets on. He does not address homosexuality ever. And its sheer absence is a very fascinating thing, because obviously it was known in the biblical world. It was a common thing in the Greco-Roman, particularly Greek, but it was addressed by by Moses or his editors, at least 1,000 years before Jesus. So the fact that it was known but not addressed by Jesus probably shows that he's addressing what he thinks were the biggest abuses in his day. And I think the 4 or 5 biggest abuses of his day included many of the things that I've got on the board here, but in terms of the sexual ethic, it probably tended to be women misusing their wives or misusing women in a demeaning, abusive, lustful sort of way. Not that other things couldn't be there, and I think you could infer principles about loving one another and putting the other person's interest ahead of your own and so forth.